Hi, everybody. It's great to be here, and thanks so much for turning out for this event. My name is Bernardine Evaristo, Professor of Creative Writing here at Brunel. I just need to go through some housekeeping. If the alarms should sound or there is a need for evacuation, please could I ask all guests to exit the auditorium as directed by our safety stewards. There and there. Okay, and this event is part of Being Human Festival taking place across the UK between the 9th to the 18th of November. Being Human is the UK's national festival of the humanities. Now, I am going to introduce the authors. I am the host for tonight. I'm going to introduce the authors and then they're all going to do a short reading from their works. And then we're going to have, I'm going to ask some questions, and we're going to have an open, wider conversation, and we're also going to open it up to you to ask questions. So the first author is Helen Cullen. Yep, there she is. Helen Cullen has published 2 novels to date, The Lost Letters of William Woolf, 2018, and The Truth Must Dazzle Gradually, 2020. The novels have sold in translation to numerous foreign markets and been optioned for screen adaptations. Helen's debut novel garnered her a Best Newcomer nomination at the 2018 Irish Book Awards. She is currently completing a PhD on creative and critical writing at UEA and is a member of the creative writing faculty at Brunel University, London. She is a regular contributor to the Sunday Times and is an Irish Times literary critic. And then we have Hannah Lowe at the end there. Hannah Lowe is a poet, memoirist, and critic. She was named a Poetry Book Society Next Generation Poet in 2014 and won a Chumney Award from the Society of Authors in 2020. Her first poetry collection, Chick 2013, won the Michael Murphy Poetry Prize. Her latest, The Kids, a PBS choice for autumn 2021, was shortlisted for the 2022 T.S. Eliot Prize and won the 2021 Costa Book of the Year. She is a reader in creative writing at Brunel University, London. And then we have Claire Lynch. Claire Lynch is Professor of English and Irish Literature here at Brunel University, London. She is the author of 3 books, including Small on Motherhoods, published in 2021. Claire was a runner-up in the Spread the Word Life Writing Prize and shortlisted in the Penguin Random House Right Now programme. Alongside numerous academic articles and book chapters, her work has been published in The Washington Post and broadcast on BBC Radio 4 and the BBC World Service. And then finally, we have Daljit Nagra, MBE, who is Professor of Creative Writing here at Brunel University, London. He is Chair of the Royal Society of Literature. He's on the Council of the Society of Authors. He is a PBS New Generation Poet and presenter of the weekly Poetry Extra programme on BBC Radio 4 Extra. Daljit has published 4 poetry collections, all with Faber and Faber, which have won the Forward Prize for Best Individual Poem and the Best First Book Prize. He's also won the South Bank Show Decibel Award and a Chumney Award. And he has been shortlisted for the Costa Prize and twice for the T.S. Eliot Prize. Can you please welcome our authors? So, first of all, in alphabetical order, I'm going to invite Helen to come up here and read 5 minutes worth of material from her work.
Thank you so much, Bernie. Hello, everybody. Wish I'd had time to change my name by deed poll so that I didn't have to go first, but here we are. So I'm just going to read to you from the very beginning of The Truth Must Dazzle Gradually. And this is from the very first page, and it opens in 2005 in Ireland on a little island off the west coast of Ireland called Inishogue, which is a fictional island. But if you've been to the Aran Islands in Ireland, a lot of it may seem familiar. Okay, here we go. It was Christmas Eve. Myrta wore tan sheepskin slippers, broken down at the heel. He shuffled to and fro along the well-worn floorboards in the shadowy hallway of the Moon family home. Smoothing unwieldy fair hair back from his forehead, he gently touched where his temples throbbed. Still damp from the rain, he hugged his cardigan tighter, and the wooden robin brooch on his lapel turned upside down. The ticking of his wristwatch was amplified in the silence, its pearlescent moon face catching the streetlight through the window and winking back. The door to the living room remained firmly closed. Christmas waited inside. The branches of a lopsided fir tree, the one he had dragged home across the Gallagher's fields 7 days before, were weighed down by decades of tinfoil garlands the children had clumsily stitched together with red wool. None would ever be thrown away, no matter how tattered they became. Every year, as the moons assemble to transform their island cottage into something akin to Santa's grotto, each child claimed their own creations with jealous possession. With ceremonial grace, their mother carefully unrolled their handiwork from the fraying white tissue paper that protected it for the other 48 weeks of the year. One by one, the decorations were placed on the tree. Over these festivities, as with all others, Myrta's wife reigned supreme, his Queen Maeve. None of the children challenged the traditions. Their mother had sewn them so meticulously into the fabric of their being, stitches that could not be outgrown. How he loved her for this gift she bestowed upon the family, permission to remain childlike in their enthusiasms, never to become embarrassed by what they had once loved. You never have to lose anyone or anything, she often said, if you just change the way you look at them. And yet he had lost her, even while he held her close, even with his eyes wide open. Myrta had woken that morning once again to an empty bed. The sheets were cool and unruffled on Maeve's side. He had expected to find her sitting at the kitchen table, wrapped in her houndstooth shawl, pale and thin in the darkness before dawn. A tangle of blue-back hair swept across her high forehead like a crow's wet wing. Her long matted curls secured in a knot at the nape of her neck with one of her red pencils. He had anticipated how she would start when he appeared in the doorway, how he would ignore, as he always did, the few moments that it would take for her dove-grey eyes to turn their focus outward, for the ghost to leave her in his presence. The kettle would hiss and spit on the stove as he stood behind her wicker chair and rubbed warmth back into her arms, his voice jolly as he gently scolded her for lack of sleep and feigned nonchalance as to its cause. But Maeve wasn't sitting at the kitchen table. Nor was she meditating on the stone step of the back door, drinking milk straight from the glass bottle it was delivered in. She wasn't dozing on the living room sofa, the television on but silent, an empty crystal tumbler tucked inside the pocket of her peacock blue silk dressing gown, the one on which she had painstakingly embroidered a murmuration of starlings in the finest silver thread. Instead, there was an empty space on the banister where her coat should have been hanging. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. So can you tell the audience a little bit about your books, about that one and also about your other one?
Hello, yes, of course, thank you. Well, I suppose in each case, both of my books, I've never been much of a planner, so they both began for me with a very hesitant initial idea that then I began to work out what else was going to happen as the story unfolded on the page. So I often say to people that I meet now at events like this, who say to me that they have an instinct that they might like to write something, but they don't know what the story is, or they can't imagine writing a whole book, or how you would get so much of it all together. And I really encourage everyone that if you have the instinct for the first line, that's all you need to get you going. In both of the cases with these books, at the very beginning, I sat down and had a few sentences, that was the start, and just allowed the thread to unravel and unravel every time I came to the page. I mean, there are loads of writers who plan out everything before they begin, and I suppose one of the things that I've learned from having the privilege of meeting lots of writers like my colleagues and at other events is that the only thing that all writers seem to have in common is that they somehow finish their books. And so I think that having that first instinct that there's something there, a thread you want to pull on, is all you need to get you going, and then you can find your own way to the end.
And so with The Truth Must Dazzle eventually, what was the inspiration for that? And can you tell people what the story is?
Yeah, so The Truth Must Dazzle gradually began for me when I was thinking about a man of my father's generation. My father is 86. And I was really blessed, I think, to have a father of that time period who did talk to me, which was sort of an anomaly in Ireland at the time, where we had all of this generation of really silent men. And I began to think about what would happen if a man like my father, who had a family like mine, there were 6 of us growing up, towards the end of his life, reveals something to his children that changed forever their impression of who he was. And so that was where it all began for me. I could picture him, just as I've read out to you, pacing up and down in the hallway of this house. And I knew that there was a secret that he wanted to tell. And I didn't know yet what it was. I didn't know yet that he had this wife, Maeve, or where she was gone. I didn't know that he had all of these children that were going to turn up by the end of the chapter. But ultimately then, what happens in the story is we realize that a tragedy has happened to this family on the night on Christmas Eve. And so then we travel back in time to the 70s when Myrta, this father figure, meets Maeve, the mother in the book, and we begin to understand what happened in the ensuing decades that brought them to this tragic Christmas Eve. And then we carry forward with them in time up until present date, and we see the aftermath of that tragedy upon each of the members of the family. And so, I mean, funnily enough, I thought I was writing a book about fatherhood, but then everybody told me I'd written a book about motherhood. So I think sometimes you have to play mind games with yourself and let yourself write whatever you feel like you're writing, and then it's only retrospectively you look back and you go, oh, actually, this is the thing I needed to talk about.
Great, thank you. Hannah, if you'd like to read something.
Yes. Hi everyone, it's great to be here. I think I'll read a few of the poems from the kids from my last book, which is about teaching. I was a sixth form teacher before I was a university lecturer. I started teaching when I was 22, so it's been 25 years now. What? I hear you cry? She can't be old enough, but I am, in fact, old enough. So I thought when I was first teaching, called like an inner city college, but what that is kind of a byword for you is incredibly working class and multi-ethnic, and there were lots of debates in the classroom, in English literature classrooms, about why we were reading the books we were reading, what counted as English literature, and then these would spill out into like how the students I taught related to the whole idea of British or English identity. And often kids from all around the world I was teaching sort of saying they didn't see themselves as being British or English, even though they might have been born here or had parents that were born here even, or even grandparents. So that got me thinking a lot about identity. But the students that were in the minority at the sixth form where I taught were actually white English kids. And this poem is for one of them. It's called The Only English Kid. When the debate got going on Englishness, I'd pity the only English kid. Poor Johnny in his spotless Reeboks and blue Fred Perry. He had a voice from history. Do no miss, yes miss, no miss, all treacly cockney, rag and bone. And while the others claimed Poland, Ghana, Bulgaria, and shook off England like the wrong team's shirt, John brewed his tea exclusively on Holloway Road. So when Asif mourned the George Cross banner swinging freely like a warning from his neighbour's roof, the subway tunnel sprayed with Muslim scum. Poor John would sit there quietly, looking guilty for all the awful things he hadn't done. So I became an English teacher because that was basically the course that was on offer, but I didn't actually have an English degree. So I had a degree in American literature, and I'd really read outside of the canon as a student. So when I became a teacher, all of a sudden I was having to teach things that I'd never read. I was having to teach things I'd never heard of before, like the Restoration. So I was often only like a week or maybe a month, sometimes a week, sometimes a few days ahead of the students. And at one point, we moved from Holloway Road to Islington, which is a bit of a more shishy area, and we started getting different kinds of students. We started getting middle-class students, basically. And I'm sure the learned audience here know that the Restoration diarist, Samuel Pepys, his name does not sound like what it is spelled like, but I did not know that at the time I was teaching. Pepys. The posh girls came and took a corner table, all lip gloss and ribbony hair, and each with a fan of starry GCSEs and a summer of youth hostels in Europe behind them, and the future wide open to them like a rainbow parasol, or so I thought. It was Restoration comedies, and I was reading the class an essay, and though I'd seen his name, I'd never heard it. Pepys, I said it, Pepys, over and over, until one girl spoke up. Do you mean Pepys? She said, her voice pulled taut as a noose, as if I were the girl and she the teacher. And what could I have said? I read on. Pepys, Pepys, Pepys. Cool as the trickster, ridiculous as the fool. And I thought I'd finish with a poem from later in the book. So the second half of the book is really about my own experiences in education. And I became a teacher because I had really good teachers, not so much in my secondary school, which is very, very traditional, and I wasn't allowed into the sixth form, can't tell you why. So I had to go off to Barking College, the local FE college. And there I met these two amazing teachers, both called John McDermott, John Toolan, who the book is dedicated to. And they just blew my mind by putting in front of me literature that really spoke to what I was interested in. You know, my father was Jamaican. I didn't know at the time that I was interested in kind of post-colonial histories and writing about race and class, but I was, and I found that out when I was being taught as a 16-year-old at this college. So the poem I'll read is named for the first book I was given to read at English A-level, which was, some of you may know it, Ntozake Shange's For Coloured Girls Who Have Considered Suicide When the Rainbow Is Enough. And it's even by today's standards, it's a very progressive, radical book. It's a poem, long poem, set to dance about the experiences of black women in America in the 70s and 80s. And at Barking College, we were mainly white working class kids reading this book at the time. I won't read the title again. Our vows were as flat as the dead fish that floated in Dagenham docks, but still John made us recite those lines meant for black women who said, I have poems, big thighs, little tits, which made us blush as our estuary tongues went tripping over cuz and enough, and the slashes the poet scattered over her page. And the whole bloody thing might well have been staged on another planet compared to Essex and my pals, whose mums served up school dinners, whose dads worked nights at Ford's. But we could just make out the half-rubbed words of last year's kids, discourse and nationhood. And soon I'd borrowed in my own new terms, hegemony, resistance, sisterhood.
So, Hannah, I was talking to some master's students today, and I mentioned Ntozake Shange's For Colour Girls Who Are Considered Suicide When the Rainbow Is Enough, because it was such a seminal text. And one of the things that I think was so powerful about that book was that she was exploring something that hadn't been explored before. And I feel that with your work, there's an element of that to it. And what I find really interesting about the kids, but also your other books, is that your voice, your spoken voice, is the same as your poetic voice. And often when people write poetry, they feel that they have to put on a different voice. And there's a gap between how they would speak and the kind of poetry they write. Can you talk to that a bit? And also the fact that you haven't lost your accent. And we know that certainly in the sort of some of the circles we move in, it's very easy to lose your accent because you feel that you have to assimilate.
Yeah, sure. And in the world of university and higher education, which is, largely a sort of solidly middle-class environment, it would be easy to kind of try and change my voice. But I guess politically, over the years, I've thrown off what you do feel about when you come from a working-class space and speak a certain way, which is a sort of, you can feel ashamed of that. But over the years, I've learned to sort of claim it really, and to speak, to speak how I was brought up, and to realise the wonderful, some of the brilliant turns of phrase that exist in Essex and East London vernacular. I guess I'm encouraged by there are other poets that are around now that are speaking in more regional accents, like Liz Berry in Black Country. So yes, there's the importance of having my voice, but also certainly in the kids, like I wanted to capture something of the brilliantly dynamic language of young people speaking in the 2000s, where their slang probably is different from what 16-year-olds are speaking now. But I was very attuned to that, to those voices when I was a teacher, and I'm still listening out now. But yeah, I've tried to stay true. But I'm sure that every now and again what's it called? Convergence and divergence. You can be in a room of really posh people and you either decide to converge by trying to speak like them or diverge by being a lot more like apples and pears. And I think that's my tendency.
I think, the other thing is that with creative writing students, I think there is always this feeling that you should be doing something. There is a certain way to write a novel. There is a certain way to write poetry. You should have a certain voice. You should be writing certain kinds of characters. And I think it's very inspiring for people to hear you because you are doing your own thing, and you are, as a result, the work is very unique. But also, as you mentioned, you've got a Jamaican father, and I know that has inspired at least a couple of your books. Can you talk about that a little?
Yeah, anyone would think I've got like dad issues. Four books actually. I've probably read that are based. Well, I can never stop writing about him. Actually, he's like that. My dad was Jamaican. He was Afro-Chinese, so he was mixed in the Caribbean, and he came to Britain in 1947. He was a professional gambler. That's what he would call himself. He was actually a card sharp, which meant that he had a saying, if you can't win it straight, win it crooked. So I grew up in a house, so there was him, and he was out all night, most nights of the week, and I didn't even know what he did when I was a kid. I used to say he was a night worker, which was true. And then there was my mum, who was a primary school teacher, so it's quite like a mix of quite legitimate and then unorthodox parents and parenting as well. But I guess typical of lots of writers, if you grow up with parents, unlike Helen, that don't talk to you, as mine didn't. So no one explained ever to me how I had a Chinese grandfather in Jamaica. I thought he'd taken a wrong turn on the way somewhere else. You become, as I did, absolutely fascinated with wanting to know, and I haven't really ever stopped digging. I think the other thing that happened is my dad died when I was quite young, and so I felt this real, bereavement of losing a father, but also I felt my connection to the Caribbean and then to China was gone. So, yeah, as long as I've been sort of teaching, I've also been trying to excavate the stories of the Chinese Caribbean and the story of my father's life. He's still a mystery to me, no matter how much I've spoken about him. Yeah.
Okay, great, thank you. Claire, your turn.
I'm going to read a little bit from my book Small, which is a memoir. It's about motherhood or motherhoods in a family with two mums, family like my family. And when you have two mums in a family, people say maybe strange, maybe quite revealing things. So when my wife was really quite heavily pregnant with twins, people would say to us things like, but what will they call you? As if that was such an obstacle that we would go, oh, do you know what? I don't know, that's going to be so difficult. Let's just call it off. So this kind of question of language that we're talking about tonight sort of inspired me to choose this bit. This is a bit from a chapter called Talk, and it's about a conversation with my twin daughters when they're about 3.5, nearly 4. So if you've ever had a conversation with a nearly 4-year-old, you might recognise some of this. She grows her best questions in a small silence, a little trance of concentration. Then, if a crane lifted up our house, would there be loads of bugs underneath it? I give it some thought. Our house swinging at the end of a steel rope, pipes and wires dangling like roots, the way insects scatter when a stone is moved. Yes, I say, as I lift her from the bath, as I wrap her in a towel, I think there would be. This is how we talk now. Surreal fantasies built from half-heard words, phrases borrowed from cartoons, picture books, dreams. The next morning, one of them tells me that the plums in the fruit bowl can predict the future. The other one can't get into bed that night because she needs a sip of her potion first. I don't contradict them, because they might be right. Why not take a tip from the plums? There are worse ideas. Far stranger than all of these fantasies are the facts fired across the breakfast table. Did you know seahorses change colour when they're in love? Did you know that smells are made from atoms? Did you know that a blue whale's heart is the size of a car? All day they come, these ambushing, disarming questions from the backseat of the car, from pillows as they slide into sleep, shy questions whispered in my ear each time I carry a small girl on my shoulders, awkward ones projected loudly, invariably in public toilets. There are technical questions too, reminders of all the things I have forgotten or never really knew in the first place. I learned to mutter something plausible, an overview of the water cycle, some bullet points on volcanoes, playing for time until I can sneak off to Google it, the size of the moon, how cars work, why trees have leaves. The children don't ask me questions because they want to hear my answers. They ask because they want to explain to me what they are seeing. They ask me what crying is for, why people have to die. It is hard, this talk. Hard not to laugh when a small child tells you she can't eat her sandwich because tuna's not her style. Hard not to be knocked off your feet when she says, don't say goodnight. I never want to be parted from you. It's hard not to be careless in what you say, how you say it. Everyone knows that the things we mean least, words thrown away in anger and exhaustion, become who we are too. People like to say that all of this talking was inevitable, women's work, so many mothers and daughters in one house. The midwife, on the day they were born, who shook her head and laughed at the very idea, how, she wondered, would anyone get a word in edgeways, as if talking is all we do. The talk is beautiful, profound, nonsense. The way they insist wood pigeons are called morning owls, that there are umbrellas for bad weather and sunbrellas for good. And when they talk, they call us by our new names, a name to summon help when a zip is stuck, when a puzzle piece is lost, when a sister won't stop or won't listen or won't give it back. The small name, an alarm in the dark that brings me running, alerting me to a wet bed or a bad dream. Babies everywhere are born with it, a word already in their mouths. Then they wait for the right moment, looking their mother in the eye, and for the first time, naming her, making her real.
So Claire, this book is creative non-fiction, right? So, but before then, you were writing academic books. So I'm really interested to know why you transitioned from academic writing to this book, and how you would describe academic writing and what it couldn't give you in terms of telling this story.
Okay, I feel like this has become a counselling session very quickly. I think there's one answer to the question, and I don't want anyone around here to get a big head about it, or other colleagues, is that I think it genuinely was powerful and inspirational to be among creative writers, actually, and to kind of hear people talking about their work, to hear you all working with students, because I'd obviously spent really my whole life thinking about books and reading, but not been on the other side of it in any way. And in some sense, there is a kind of limit to what you understand, unless you've sort of tried to at least put your money where your mouth is a little bit and see it from the other side. So I think it was that, really, was part of it. And then also I think having an experience or a story that I felt I wanted to write about, actually. And so there's a sort of sense that maybe I'd had a reverence for writing and writers, because I'd been so sort of in an academic sense.
You mean creative writers?
Yeah, creative writers, because academic writing is a different thing, and it's still very similar in lots of ways. There's still the business of you have to be sitting down at your computer at some point and getting it out there and facing all of this sort of sense of making your thoughts public. But it's a different way of seeing, is how it feels to me. A different way of kind of seeing and thinking about things. So I'm not totally off the hook with academic writing. That's still, a thing that I care about, I think I'm doing. But even that, I think, has been transformed, actually, by thinking about writing in a way that this book and this kind of experience has given me. Yeah.
And when you wrote Small, was it a problem for you? Was it challenging? Because you had written up to this point, I think, academic writing.
Yeah, I learned very quickly in this process that in the world of mainstream publishing, academic is an insult. Like it's a direct, just in the way that sort of professor is a kind of prison nickname. Do you know what I mean? And so there's sort of idea that they would, if there was ever a comment like, this is getting a bit academic, I understood that meant awful. Like, sort of not powerful or funny or any of the things that we want the book to be, get rid of it. So it was a challenge. I think the reverse challenge is also quite hard, actually, is to sort of remember how to get back into that register. And maybe I don't think I will go back quite in the same way, because there's no reason academic writing should not be impenetrable. That's not the aim either. But yeah, it was a challenge, but it was also a real it was a freeing experience too.
Because you could put your emotion into the book, couldn't you?
Yeah,
and that is a no-no, right, with academic writing?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think there's, I think
is it not?
I think it's evolving, and I think it depends a little bit. So Hannah and I both work in kind of life writing as a field, and I think the theory around life writing is a bit more space for that. But yeah, for the most part, the assumption is that you're a brain on a stick, and the words, should not bypass your soul in any way in academic writing. So, it's possible to do both things. But yeah, it definitely was a kind of a completely different thing to do.
And one last question. Who were you writing the book for? Were you thinking of your daughters?
All the time, yeah. Because, I mean, I'm conscious. I mean, on the one hand, I think, who really wants to read a book by their mum? Nobody. So maybe they won't read it. But also they might, right? And so there's this kind of sense of, in a kind of ethics sense, I wanted to make sure I was never writing anything that would be, that was kind of beyond, so that the children aren't named in the book, for example. So I know kind of who said that thing in the bath, but, it's not in the book. That's not kind of made public at that level, if you see what I mean. So I was writing it with them in mind, but I think also one of the things that, again, is different from academic writing is when you write a book that's kind of in the world in a different way, the people who then contact you afterwards and say, I've never seen that story out there and I needed to see it, or that kind of is my experience too and I wanted to see that on the page. So it sort of, it meets a different audience, doesn't it, that you don't anticipate. And I think you probably can't hold them in mind when you're writing it, but it's lovely to find them when it's finished.
Great, thank you. Okay, Daljit.
It's lovely to hear Claire as a symbol of conversion to creative writing. End of academia. So I'm just going to read a little extract from my new book, which came out a couple of months ago, and it's called Indium, so idiom, but with an N in it. And it's a really peculiar book. So the book imagines it's a script of a film, an imaginary film. And in this film, there's a group of poets who are workshopping an idea, and there's a camera crew. So we usually hear from both of them. And it's all about kind of language, and in particular about Babu English and Coolie English. So if we go back to the 19th century, during the Raj, Indians ran the empire, as it were, from the Indian clerics who were highly educated. They knew their Virgil, they knew their Shakespeare, but English wasn't their kind of normal speak. So they had this really kind of interesting way of speaking. So in my poem, some of the writers speak in a kind of low Babu, which is kind of almost the kind of normal ornate way. Medium and high Babu have sort of Coolie English as well. So I don't know if that's confused things, but it's fine. And it gets slightly more confusing as it goes on. Anyway, I'm just going to read a section where the chair of the poets, Mr. Vishnudas Desanni, just opens the conversation about Babu English. So I'll read a bit of that, and we'll hear a little bit from the camera crew as well. So, hail all committee, muses, etc. Council must take arms against the dulce et decorum of conflicts, to blot onwards in pure English or rage for idioms. Ho for Babu, our conjugal cake of Englishes, our marzipan juggernaut with which we mellow our poetic muse. Persian in India was replaced by English for Queen Victoria, for our knee salute and clerical charge in white collar. English was never for us an hors d'oeuvres and colloquy. Happy keeping Sahib's books, hoc est broke verbum meum. Happy with hand by heart quoting Homer's encomium. In a phonetics that rouged the lugs of Dr. Johnson. Our reward? We became buds from Kipling to Orwell, onward to Rushdie. Pratfall Bubbles. How do we repel this sowing of the purse so pockets of scorn do not reap? Does our language of resistance sound queer as a clockwork orange? A stitch in canonical time that's holding on with empire wounds? Are we the musical of Frankenstein? All I can say, our national tree have limbs bountiful, willy-nilly brewing fetus who are wide-moored, reared tall in Coolie or Babu. Does English breed? By our windfall. Our windfall abounds. I say it is here with my yellow cross garters, with the camera crew decked in pink dayglow. It's with our own Clee Hills, there, where Shropshire lads are buried and hope for rebirth in our Babu tongue. I can no more compass mentis far off Bodu Babu than Coolie Telugu's hawking. Each mulligatawny is a milieu music. All hail muse, I have unpicnicked the gingham of the grass. So director whispers to camera operator, our troubadours must be more phlegm and clement. They're cheering doolally, swinging in the seat. Camera operator whispers back, Mr. Vishnudas is his own bel esprit. How his head it fall, then jut like a turban warrior to duplicate our bombasticated guru, Henry at Agincourt. Who would mock the mixed metaphors, the panjandrum of jollity Mr. Desanni is used? I'll stop there. It goes on for a couple hundred pages like that. Thank you.
So, Daljit, you are somebody who plays with language, subverts language, uses a lot of vernacular in your writing, draw on your cultural background with your writing. Can you tell us where that comes from? When you're writing, are your parents in the back of your mind, for example?
Yeah, probably when I first started, my parents didn't really speak English when I was growing up, so we spoke Punjabi at home, and we had quite a lot of relatives living with us. It's quite a packed house, a couple of miles from here actually, and yeah, I guess people throw in the odd English word out of context, and they probably sort of laugh a bit at it and throw in the odd phrase, and they didn't quite know what these things meant, and they probably heard it from their bosses at work in the factories. So I think that probably played into the kind of writing when I first started. So probably that's a version of standard English, or that pure English, probably came from that, I think, that need to probably reproduce something that you'd heard and probably forgotten about, and then it suddenly surfaces in your creative writing, because you're never sure what's going to come forward when you start writing. So it's a peculiar experience. So I think it's partly that, and then became a kind of virtue in itself to find ways to see how it could push English to its limits whilst it sort of remains comprehensible. And I guess this book is the latest experiment in that, by kind of uncovering something historical, like kind of, Victorian English, which to some degree still exists. And I guess my parents would speak a coolie English, and one or two of the characters try out a kind of English which is very minimal in its use of English language, or it subverts the rules excessively and has the odd Indian word thrown in.
I mean, in a sense, it's very erudite, because you also studied English at university, didn't you? And there are always literary references in your books at the same time, so it's always a sort of a mixture of the two going on. I would say probably in most of your books, if I've got that correct.
Yeah, I agree. I'm trying to out-English the English. That's my aim. Partly just see what I can do with the canon, because I think the very act of me, even the act of appearing to adore an English poet, a canonical poet, is always going to be read differently. It's never going to seen. It's either going to be seen as kind of empire worship, or I think the way I end up doing it is sort of quite cheeky, and probably because that's my take on it. So hopefully it gives it more nuance, that allusion. So it's never a kind of earnest allusion, earnest set of references to historical writers, but it's always sort of trying to find an interesting way to look at them.
But also, I mean, I think this book is so totally its own thing. It is so unique. I don't know anybody who's attempted to do what you're doing with this. Where do you get the freedom to do that? Because, I was talking to Hannah earlier about people feeling that they have to do a certain thing with their writing. And you have just blown everything out of the water, in a sense, with this book.
Yeah, well, thank you for asking that question, because my last book came out just over 5 years ago, and then after that, I in my head decided I don't want to write sort of 30-line kind of poems. I don't want to be doing that for the rest of my career, because that becomes like a job, and I've always written as a hobby. So for a couple of years, I kept sort of rejecting poems in my head. I thought, oh, I've done that before, I can do that. And then this idea came for this kind of poem, and it's going to be one poem, and I just thought, how can I push it out? What can I do? And I kept pushing it out and out and out and having more fun until it became this kind of big dramatic device where a group of characters are talking and they were exploring a type of English that exists and that might exist in the future of the many Englishes we encounter. So it's really an attempt to find that. And then I think also the breakthrough for me was just to thinking about setting as an in-between poet. I thought, if I can conceptualize setting, make it an abstract thing, so have it physical, but find ways to abstract setting itself, because that feels a burden to me, to have a physical place, and I exist in that place, my character exists. So I found kind of ways to deal with that, which were really enjoyable to me.
So you just threw something in there, which I've heard you say before, and that is that writing is a hobby for you. Yeah. Which every time you say it, it shocks me. Daljit is one of our most celebrated poets, right, in the UK. And for you to say, oh, yeah, but it's just a hobby, I mean, nobody says that, right? So can you explain this belief system that you have?
Well, I mean, I came late to writing. I mean, I didn't start writing until I was about 30. I just think I wasn't entitled to write. And I just wrote for fun. I didn't seek to get published or anything. I just wrote as a hobby, just for fun, to amuse myself. And I've tried really hard to preserve that aspect of writing for myself, that every time a book finishes, I want to feel like I'm just having a good laugh. There's no expectation. So I don't have an agent, because the terror of the thought of having an agent that I have to write for somebody. And my editor at Faber's been really good, just left me alone, and he's been very gentle and just lets me do what I want. So my feeling is I might write a book in 20 years' time, I might never write a book, or might have one in 2 years' time. And I'm just going to have a really good time writing it. So if a poem isn't stimulating me or fun, I just scrap it because there's no expectation. So there's things like that you do. I mean, ultimately, I've got to be having a really good time with that poem. Otherwise, I'm not interested.
You know, so many writers talk about how they suffer when they write.
No
and
suffering.
They're like, oh my God, I do it, but it's so painful. And I always think, why are you doing it? You know, there's plenty of us out there. You don't need to do it if it's so painful for you. But what you're saying is... I agree. Yeah, you agree. But what you're saying is, I want to have fun and I want to enjoy it. And that is so refreshing. And so it's like you're tricking yourself, aren't you? In a way. Tricking yourself into thinking this isn't really a career. It is just a hobby. And that keeps you in that zone that you were in at the beginning when you were writing. You know, when we start writing our books before we're published, there is often a lot of freedom, and then you go into the machine of publishing, and it can become the real business. And there are all kinds of pressures on you, and you get the critics and the rest of it, which you have to deal with. But for you to protect your integrity as a writer and your relationship to the text, you say it's a hobby.
Yeah, I think it is really important.
But as a hobby, he's incredibly successful, I have to say.
Well, I mean, it's the vanity. You know, there's vanities around writing you can get sucked into.
No, really?
That, you know, you see so many writers get damaged by it, and they burn out. You know, after 2-3 books. You know, we've seen that, haven't we? People write a couple of books and they're just really embittered and angry, and so you have to protect yourself and find other ways to treat prizes and success as a kind of vanity, as a plus. And really what it's about is the writing and the enjoyment in it. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So I'm just going to throw a question open to everybody on the panel, and then I'll throw it open to the audience. So can you tell us something about your process as a writer? Like how long does, for example, Hannah, how long does it take you to craft one of those poems? I mean, some people might think you sit down, you write it, 10 minutes later it's done.
Oh, God, no. No, I mean, back into the territory of writing as torture. No, I mean, they're all Shakespearean and Petrarchan sonnets, so they're metrical and they're rhyming, so they're very labour-intensive. But it's not true that I found them torturous. It has the pleasure of, like, advanced Sudoku or a crossword, working with form in that way, and it pushes your imagination way further than you ever thought it could go, because you're writing with such tight constraint, and that gives me an enormous pleasure because I'm a masochist. No, it gives me an enormous amount of pleasure, and it's still what I love doing. It's a bit of poetry I love the most, is working with intricate, difficult form. I don't really know why, but yeah, so they don't come quickly.
How long?
No.
How long would it take you?
Some of those poems took years. I mean, I'm not working them every day, but I might be in 50, 60 drafts of a poem. They come quicker now, because I think if you write 100 sonnets, they do get a little bit easier with the fluency, but no, they're really labour-intensive, and that's why I find that like lots of poets new to the scene aren't interested in form. They say things like, oh, it's just so bourgeois and traditional and male, and I'm thinking, yeah, or is it too much work? Yeah. So they take a long time, those kinds of poems.
Okay, lovely. Helen, what about you?
So for me, I guess, because, I mean, in both cases, the novels have taken a few years to get to, I guess, the point when they're published, which doesn't necessarily mean they feel finished in your mind, but at the point that you let them go. I think, in general, my process is that I write into the dark in the first draft, and I just let the story unfold in whatever way feels instinctive. And I think that every single day when I sit down to write, I think nothing's going to happen. And it feels impossible that you will pull something from the dark and it will appear on the page. But I think the act of showing up for your creativity stimulates it. And I think that creativity only happens when you create the opportunity for it. So I think if I was to walk around and wait for the moment when I suddenly knew, oh, this is how this whole section is going to come together, or this is exactly what's going to happen in this chapter, then I would probably never write anything. You know, I have to write my way through it. And so eventually I get to the end of a first draft, and at that point then I can sort of take a step back from it and begin to understand, you know, what's going on in the novel, you know, what are the themes that are coming through, what's the big question at the heart of this that may not have been obvious to me at the beginning that I'm trying to resolve. And then I can go back into it and really think about the design of the novel and really think about the language that I'm using throughout. I don't change that much usually on a line edit basis after I've written that first draft, but I do a lot more work in terms of structural stuff, and sometimes carrying through ideas that maybe I had. Later on, it became clear to me, oh, actually, this is a really significant, you know, motif that I hadn't really discovered yet at the beginning. So, you know, pulling threads through. But I think that for me, the first draft is very instinctive, and then it becomes something more technical when I begin to try and think about how the whole thing is working as a whole. But I think everybody finds their own way of doing it, and you can trust yourself. I mean, we're talking about language and creativity tonight, and I think allowing yourself to tune into that voice in your own mind, that's your own authentic language that's being constructed by the voices you heard growing up and the books that you've read and the people that are around you, you know, that is what will unlock your creativity, I think, by allowing yourself to speak on the page in that really pure internal voice that you have. I think that's where you'll find your process.
And can I just ask you, how confident do you feel when you're writing?
I feel confident when I'm writing, but I don't feel confident when I'm not writing. So when I'm not doing work, I fear that I will never work again. I worry about what I've written after I've written it. I worry about what I'm going to write before I write it. But when I'm actually in the flow, I'm fine. I don't worry then about, I'm quite good at silencing the inner critic in the act itself. It just haunts me every other hour of the day. So I think that's it. That's really, you know, I think that's
Did you
important.
have to learn to silence the inner critic? Or were you always able to silence?
Well, I think what's interesting, like Daljit was saying, is that no one ever believes this when you're talking to writers who haven't been published yet. Probably the most pleasure you'll ever have in writing is writing the book that before anybody has read it. When it's just you and you're in this process of discovery and you're working out what sort of writer you want to be and what you're thinking about, and you're writing with the door closed. So I think when I first began writing my first novel, I hadn't, like Daljit again, I was in my 30s. I'd had an instinct I wanted to write, but thought that writers were born and not made. And so I thought real writers just can do this. They're compelled to do this. They've been, you know, you go to panels like this and writers would say things like, I wrote my first story when I was 4 and then I never stopped writing. And it just felt really intimidating to me. I thought that, well, when the books that I read, the poetry that I read, that had just come out like that, pure and perfect, the first time for these writers, and I couldn't even conceive of doing something like that. So I really resisted that instinct that I had to try and do it for a really, really long time. And then eventually the fear of never writing anything overcame the fear of not being able to do it. And I went to a writing workshop, and we had 2 weeks where you had to prepare 5,000 words that then you'd share in the group, like many of the students here will have done in the writing workshop. And I spent 13 days panicking, having never written anything before, and on the 13th night I sat down and wrote probably maybe 2,000 words or whatever. And those 2,000 words became the first 2,000 words of the first book that I published. And it was like they had been sitting there waiting for me just to sit down, because your work is all you have, you're all your work has. So if you don't show up for it, it can never be released. And so I share that story only because I think it's almost like my identity as a writer turned on a sixpence. You know, I could easily never have written anything if I hadn't somehow created a circumstance and an opportunity that forced me to push past my own anxiety about it and to try and put something down. So I'm sure lots of people in here have some little whisper percolating in the back of their minds, and I think that's all you need to get you going.
Lovely, thank you. Claire?
Well, I hope the process by which I wrote this book is not the ongoing process by which I write books, because I was trying, I think, to kind of capture this early motherhood bit as it was happening. So, you know, there's some of this where I've got like my hand on the notes app of my phone and the other hand through the bars of a cot, you know, trying to get the kind of first version of it down. But then, like everyone else, I think very similarly that this sort of, years of kind of a version of it and the next version and the next version until... One thing that I would say is I think there were lots of just not the right version, let's say. I was going to say terrible, but that's a bit harsh. Just not the right version of it, because I was trying, I think, to do what I thought writing should look like. And then, in the end, sort of left it for a bit, and then realised what I needed to do was take away so much of it to kind of see what it really was. And I'm finding that I think, is something that is always going to be true for how I write, actually, is that I'm kind of happy with that sort of, you know, the sort of, that version where it's in there underneath, but getting it out there first and then taking it away seems to work better for me. And
Do you mean reducing the word count?
Yeah,
I mean
cutting, and almost every time being able to say, you know, that's not necessary, that's not, what's the kind of smallest number of words I need to make that point? So, I mean, hopefully, you know, the more I would try and, you know, work in that way, the kind of, maybe the fewer kind of iterations of the rubbish version first, I don't know. But it seems necessary, maybe, to kind of get that down. And I think there's a freedom in that, in feeling that you don't have to do the, you know, the best version isn't going to come in that first moment. So it's okay to have that kind of rough note on your phone that's the first idea, because the rest of it will come later, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Daljit, do you want to add something?
Well, just to add, I think I agree with everything that's been said. I think a lot of the writing is done when you're not actually writing. You're thinking, you're constructing it in your head. I tend to spend loads of time not actually writing, not forcing myself to write, and trying to withhold writing, just so I've got the right texture, the language, the speed of the text, the kind of perspectives, as much as I can get right in my head, and then going away researching, and then I think when you write, there's that frisson, isn't there, where you constantly think, it's not going to work. And I've spent even half a year on this thing, it's not going to work. And you're trying to make it work, and you're trying to find new ways to make it work. That's really exciting. It's hard, isn't it? Physically exhausting as well, in a sense. But there's a great pleasure to be had there, I think, the fear of it not working.
Yes, okay, great, thank you. So I'm going to now open out to the audience. This is a roving mic, believe it or not. I can throw at somebody. So if you'd like to put your hand up, if you'd like to ask a question, and just to say, please ask a question, one question, not several, and no lectures. If you start lecturing, I will have to stop you, sorry, because we haven't got a lot of time. So, okay, yes, lady here.
Hi. I'm a big admirer of all of you. But this question is for specifically Hannah and Daljit, because I'm interested in how you mentioned that because you have an accent or you have a way of dealing with language in a different way than the standard English. And for some of us, it's writing in a non-standard English. It's a fight. It's also something that you have to inhabit politically, as you said. And it's a stance. So then how did you find your voice politically? How did you inhabit that place in the first, and felt confident enough to accept yourself as this person and this writer and think as an advantage to your creativity?
Only to say I was aware of what I was doing, but I didn't think anyone would be interested. I was doing something quite quirky and odd, and very political in the sense of the language itself, but also some of the ideas. And what I found, to my great surprise, I've noticed since then, is that if you do something ever so slightly different, editors out there are fascinated, they're desperate for it. And I've spoken to enough poetry editors, and they're always looking for something different because everything sounds so samey. So I would say it's a virtue if you can find any little difference in your style.
Yeah, I would say that unlike Daljit, I wasn't aware of it. I just thought I was like everyone else, and I also,
growing up in Ilford, I was actually like posh because my mum was a primary school teacher. So the idea that I'm now seen as being a working class poet is kind of hilarious. But I did, you know, my class consciousness began at university when I realised that actually living in a 3-bed Pebble Dash semi was not luxury because there were kids that were living in massive houses out of like Richard Curtis films. But it's been like a really slow process of waking up. Things like cultural capital, like when you have parents or grandparents that took you to the theatre, when you know about that stuff, when you know the canon because the books are on your bookshelves. But what I had was an alternative. I had I had parents that were kind of left-wing and quite radical thinkers. There was a different kind of library in my house, and there was the first books that the books that were in my house, a lot of books about Jamaican history and politics, West Indian poetry. So, you know, those sorts of texts are still my nodal points, I guess. They're the books that I still think of. They were foundational in my childhood. What am I trying to say? Only that it took me a very long time to wake up, and I was never conscious that my voice was different until other people started telling me. And now probably I've mined it a bit, but it's still my voice. So...
Great, let's take another question. Yes, gentleman here.
Okay, so something that a lot of writers face is anxieties or fears either right before you send in the final draft, or anxieties right the moment before it gets published or an important review from a famous critic is coming in. So how did you guys deal with your first-time anxieties about your final draft or your day of publishing?
I'll have a go at this one. Yeah, so this book was published during lockdown. So really, I didn't believe it was happening. And the launch was kind of online, like Waterstones did a thing, but it was just virtual. And it really was only the kind of day that it was coming out, and I went into town and saw it, you know, mask, bookshelf. I was like, oh God, it's actually going to... So my anxiety was entirely delayed because it all felt like a little online sort of pen pal relationship I'd had with this editor, that we would just have Zoom meetings and give each other feedback, and it was nice. So what I'm saying is denial, actually, now I'm telling the story, actually, isn't it? And I hadn't really thought about it, but I think these more experienced people might have a kind of different sense of it, but I think the excitement of it was just about enough to kind of overcome any of the anxiety. So hopefully by the time you get to that stage, you've also had, you know, lots of other people are invested in that process. And I would say it's one of the big differences between academic and non-academic writing, is that real engagement with editors and other people who have really shown such care over all of it that by the time it is out in the world, you feel like it's not just you. You know, there's a kind of whole set of people who have, you know, been part of it, which is a bit of a protection, maybe.
I mean, I'll answer that as well, because, you know, with a novel or non-fiction, often you do get reviewed in the national newspapers, and it never gets any easier. You know, that moment before the reviews come out is really anxiety-inducing for me, because you don't know what they're going to say, and often you've spent years, you know, maybe 6 years on a novel, and then that critic can demolish it in 600 words. So it's something you just have to live with, from my experience. And because that's all you can do, is live with. Some people don't read their reviews. Some people, my husband reads my reviews often before I read them, so that I watch his face to see how he's responding. I'm like, is that okay? It's life. It's life. I think as a writer, you are not in control of what the critics are going to say, unless you get your mates. And you're not supposed to do that, right? But people do. But you're not in control of it. So all you can do is believe in your work and know that it's out there and that it will reach its audience. Does anybody want to add to that? Yeah. Okay, let's take another question. How about over here? Okay, gentleman here.
So basically, I noticed that the publishing industry appears to have an expectation from the writer to have a social identity, or like an influencer, to be honest. What's your view on that? It appears like you need to be out there, like you need to be less of a writer and more of a personality.
You know, that's something that started to change maybe about 10 years ago, when you would get press releases for books and they would mention the social media profile of usually a debut author. And it was like, they've got a big following on whatever platform it was. And I remember being infuriated by this because, you know, obviously it was not about the work. It's about how popular they are in certain kind of area of life, which is online. Not everybody is online. Not everybody is on social media. I would say that still exists. Perhaps not in the poetry world so much, but definitely not, I don't think, in academia. But it does exist, and it's just something you have to deal with. You know, it's the world we're living in. You know, I think people with large social media profiles sometimes do get book deals very easily. Maybe they don't even write those books, right? Because the editors will write them. But they know they'll be able to sell them because of their following of hundreds of thousands, if not millions, if not tens of millions. So it's a force to be reckoned with in the publishing world now. So, yes, lady here.
Hello, my name is Shahida Merban. I'm on the Master's Creative Writing this year. I've also got 8 books out, but obviously I haven't made it, you know, to the capacity that you lot have. But obviously you could say it's almost like a struggle trying to reach editors and all the rest of it. But my key question is that when you think of a central character in your book, do you often find that after many days, when you've written so many pages, that perhaps you're sleeping and all of a sudden something comes in your head? And it's almost like someone's whispering at the back of your mind saying that actually this character wouldn't do that. This character wouldn't dress like that. She's really not like that at all. So then when you wake up, do you just think about it and leave it, or would you change it? Because I often find that sometimes, you know, it keeps coming back that no, she wouldn't be doing that, she wouldn't be doing that. And then I go around and I think, okay, perhaps I can just tweak that little bit. Do you often find that?
Your subconscious talking to you. Anyone want to answer that?
Well, I mean, I think our subconscious is probably where all our writing is coming from. So it sounds like you have a very authentic connection to your subconscious that's driving your writing forward. I think that for some people, it will be very explicit to them that they're drawing from somewhere deep in their subconscious. I think for others, that's something that will be revealed to them through the writing on the page. And I think, definitely as I think you become more invested in your characters and you spend more time with them and they become more and more alive to you. And so then I think people sometimes talk about it in a way that feels otherworldly, that their characters are talking to them. But I mean, I believe that it is all coming from inside you. So you have everything that you need to create characters, to write your books, to create whole worlds already inside you, inside of your mind. And you're just accessing that, I think, in your subconscious. And that will reveal itself to different people in all sorts of different ways, I think.
Okay, let's take another question. Yeah, gentleman over here.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd particularly like to pose this question to Daljit, please. I know that all authors, in their own way, have a unique approach to writing, but what you was reading was something that's taken the idea of writing to a whole new level, in a different direction. If you was starting off as an unknown author, would you have trouble with that style of writing, getting a publishing house interested? Or would you have to self-publish?
Well, my debut book, Look We Have Coming to Dover, that poem is much harder than anything I just read then. And I just put it away for a couple of years. I thought I wrote it for me, I had a great time writing it. And then at some point I sent it to a poetry magazine. They put it on their first page, and it went on to win this prize. So I was shocked. I thought, no, I tried a magazine, thought they wouldn't publish it, but I'll try them just out of interest, because I need to get enough poems for a collection at that point in my head. So there was a massive interest in that poem itself, and I did sort of radio interviews, and I got loads of bookings for readings on the back of that one poem. And it's, it's been taught at A-level now for about a decade. So I'm not sure, there's no right answer, is there, to these things? I mean, publishers often talk about the next best thing. I remember doing some teaching at Goldsmiths, and everyone talked about this particular person's going to be massive. They were good looking, they're young, they had this great novel, everything was right, and nothing happened. It came out and it just flopped. And I just remember that person, it was just like really amazing. I was thinking, the academics are talking about it's going to be really big. And that happens all the time, we just don't know. I mean, Look We Have Coming to Dover. Why the hell would anyone want to read that? Why would anyone want to teach it? 'Cause it's really difficult. I don't know. I mean, so it's still a mystery, isn't it, these things?
It's very interesting. It's a really interesting question because, because you've been with Faber now for how many years? Quite a few years. Yeah. So they are going to continue to publish you, I imagine. So you can be really, really experimental, and they will hopefully still publish you. But if this book landed on an editor's desk and they were less kind of imaginative than your editors at Faber, they might reject it, because it is so different to everything that's out there. Okay, let's take a couple more questions. Yes, Emma. Yeah, what happened to the bouncy thingy? Do you prefer it? You're holding on to it, man.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask about ruthlessness. And I think you'd mentioned, Bernie, in a monologues class we had, that you had to be slightly ruthless in order to be successful. So I just wanted to ask the panel, is that true, do you think? And how...
What did I say exactly? Let's not have this strict of context. Ruthless in what way?
Well, that's what I want to ask about, just to unpick, sort of, do you need to be does one need to be ruthless, and how does that ruthlessness manifest itself?
Ruthless, but in what way? Ruthless
in terms
with your writing, with your relationships?
Maybe with your time, or maybe potentially with your boundaries, like, no, I can't do this because this is my writing time, or maybe you could say being ruthless in your single-mindedness. I don't know. I mean, ruthless.
Okay, does anyone want to answer that? No. Any of you?
I can say something about
yes.
it, because I'm not very ruthless, and that's I think when it comes to things like time and boundaries, those are the two things you said, and I thought, oh yeah, I can relate to that in writing, because if you don't make time for your writing, especially once you've been published, if there's like some interest in your work, you will find yourself being invited to lots and lots of things, or given lots of opportunities, or invited to teach workshops or get in mentoring. And when you're first in that position of being asked, if you want to do it, you want to do it. But one thing I've noticed in my career is that I've done so much of that I was often doing only that and never any writing. So it's something I'm trying to, only now, like 15 years after first getting published, am I trying to sort of say, actually, no, the writing's really, like, as Helen said, like, show up for it and not just think it's something that will just fall into my lap or float down if I don't protect the time. But it's taken me a long, again, a long time to kind of learn that. Ruthless with the work, I mean, that makes sense to me as well, as in, whenever you have the thought, oh, that line, I can just get away with that, you can't, right? So it's really, again, it's about what the subconscious does. You might, for me, it's often in poetry, but also in non-fiction as well. I'll be reading something I've written, and I'll just have that little almost like a little twitch in my mind that that bit doesn't really ring true or something, and then I think I can get away with it, and I go to a workshop and I can't, you know, that's the thing everyone always says without fail. So there's a kind of, ruthless isn't the right word here, but a sort of, you can't bullshit yourself. Yeah, so you have to be ruthless with yourself in writing as well, if that makes sense.
Anyone else want to add to that?
Just to add, taking criticism is kind of really important. My experience of working with students at universities or loads of adults in evening classes, some people don't take on board any criticism. They'll show up with the same poem a year later, and adults, and you've done that. And I've taught an ARV on residential courses, and you get some people turn up to different courses year on year with the same set of poems. They're looking for someone to vindicate that work. And it's really important to take on board criticism and seek it, go out looking for it.
You have to be ruthless with your time, because often, even though people know you're a published writer, if you're at home, for example, they'll think, well, you can do this because you're at home. They can't quite compute that actually you're at home and you're working. You know, even today, people don't take it seriously, because you're not, if you say I'm at work and I'm working from 8 o'clock to 5 o'clock, people understand that. But if you're at home, and you know, and actually a lot of us work through the week and through the weekend, right up till late, people don't quite grasp that. So sometimes you have to be really ruthless with your time. And also, when you are a writer, people want things from you for nothing, right? It's very interesting. You know, lawyers would charge you per second. Accountants would charge you per second. We'd all be millionaires probably, right? Because there is something about our industry, which is a positive thing sometimes, that people want things. They want you to give quotes for the books, and there are all kinds of ways in which your time is being used and you're not being recompensed for it at all. And sometimes you've got to be ruthless. You've got to say, no, I'm not doing that. And people don't like it. But, you know, you have to protect your writing time, and you also have to protect your leisure time as well. Anyone else? One last question? Okay, yeah. And that really is the last question.
So I'm a great fan of all of your writing, and it's brought me so much joy, or of your poetry and your novels, and I just wondered, what is it about this job or hobby that brings you the most joy? Is it the creativity of it?
Who wants to kick off? Claire?
Obviously the students. The microphone wasn't on. Obviously the students, I said, which is true, but also I think the real pleasure that is being lost in the work and being, you know, looking up and thinking, oh God, where has time gone? And I've been in it. When it's like a really kind of nitty-gritty thing that you're trying to fix, or kind of getting to the end of some draft, that is a real a joy, isn't it? That is not true of all experiences, really. So that sort of moment, you know, alone with your... Imagine it's more romantic and it's like a typewriter looking over the lake, not just your laptop, you know. But that's the real thing.
Just to add, you're building a building. It's like an architect's image, and once it's built, it's just a wonderful experience that you've had. Your little vanity project, and it's finished, and that's really satisfying when you've constructed it and you feel this is imperishable according to the best of your abilities.
I think honestly for me, the thing that gives me the most pleasure out of making time in my life for writing, and I guess just following on from what we said before, you don't have to be a published writer to feel like you can have time in your life to write. You know, you deserve that, and you should make that an important part of the way you live. But for me, I think one of the greatest pleasures for me in this is knowing that there's generations and generations of women who came before me in Ireland who weren't allowed to do this. You know, I look at my mother, who was probably a writer who couldn't write. She had that instinct, it was inside her, but her circumstances, you know, her lifestyle, her culture, the Ireland that she was growing up in, it was all but impossible for her, you know, to find herself on the page. So, you know, when my books were published, you know, anytime I produce something, I just think it gives me so much joy to know that I've been given that privilege of being able to have a voice when so many women who came behind me didn't have it.
Yeah, to add to that, I would just say that being creative, like, you know, we're born creative, aren't we? As human beings, we are creative, and then we're often educated out of creativity. But by secondary school, it's often gone, and the essay has become the main medium of communication. And when our students turn up to Brunel, the undergraduates doing creative writing, I always want to like give them an award for hanging on to their creativity or coming back to it if they'd lost it, you know, some of their teenage years. But that's what I got when I found poetry again, which actually I came to through teaching it, not till my late 20s. I felt like it was a long, cool drink of water because I'd missed it so much, but I'd never, you know, I hadn't known that because I'd been too busy trying to be clever and writing essays. And then from that, when I look through my phone now and all the writers I know, when I had a child with a poet, that wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been for poetry. But he's actually not who I think of. I actually think of the dear friends I've made through writing and through knowing other creative people, and how it's a massive life upgrade from how I was living before. So, you know, that's what I'm grateful for.
Yeah, I think joy is the act of creation and communication out into the world, and it's something unique. Whether we're good or not is beside the point. We are creating something unique that goes out into the world, and that is a very powerful thing to be doing. Okay, folks, thank you very much for coming, please. Wonderful panel. Most of us will be outside, so do come and chat to us, and yeah, thank you.